The world-famous Renaissance painting The Tempest, in Italian La Tempesta, painted at the beginning of the 16th century by the Venetian master Giorgione, has, over the last 150 years, led to a vast number of different explanations and suggestions as to what might be the painting's subject. Many scholars and art historians suggest that this picture conceals a kind of sophisticated riddle or a complex allegory on contemporary political events. Recent research, however, reveals serious indication that this work of art does not contain an extravagant and enigmatic subject or could be an undetermined poetical fantasy. It seems very likely that The Tempest has a clearly defined subject and integrates quite a number of elements of typical contemporary pictorial tradition. A rather conventional reading in terms of iconography and in the context of North Italian painting around the year 1500 leads to the conclusion that this painting's origin is not to be found in Venice. It was probably not commissioned by a Venetian citizen. The male figure standing on the left is described by Marcantonio Michel, who first mentioned the painting in the year 1530, as a soldier. The man wears a red and white garment with artificial slashes in his trousers. The colors of the Carrara's family's coat of arms were red and white. The man's trousers and shoes resemble the garment of the imperial Landsknechts, the soldiers or mercenaries of the German emperor, which were well known in northern Italy in Michel's times, when the Habsburg Emperor Charles V was at war with France and its Italian allies. The fancy slashes were supposed to be a symbolic battle trophy, proving that the man had survived a fight with knives. The origin of the German term Landsknecht does not derive from Land, as was often proposed, but from the lance, which was the chief weapon of armed foot soldiers in the early 16th century. This is well illustrated in the famous painting The Battle of Alexander by Albrecht Altdorfer and many other closely related battle pictures, such as the Battle of Pavia in 1525 and the Siege of Vienna. The word Lanzenknecht became so popular that it was adopted in Italian and transformed into Lanzichenecco. The man holds his left hand on his back above the hips, which is a typical gesture of the imperial German soldiers. German artists such as Albrecht Dürer, Lukas Cranach, and Hans Schäufelein produced an enormous variety of woodcuts and engravings depicting Landsknechts, many of which hold a standard or a pike in their right hand and keep the left on their hips or on their lower back. The hand is thus positioned near the sword handle or exposing the sword. The print work by the Franconian artists was distributed in many parts of Europe, so that, already at the beginning of the 16th century, the typical soldier's features were already known to North Italian artists. Occasionally, of course, the left and right sides of pictures became reversed due to printing techniques. Around the year 1510, Dorsodossi paints an illustration of an episode from the Aeneid for the Duke of Este in Ferrara, depicting two soldiers from ancient Rome. Both men, presumably Aeneas and Achates, appear in the fancy gear of Landsknecht soldiers. One of them holds his left hand on his back and sets one foot in front, as shown in Giorgione's painting. These gestures were later to become firm emblems in portraits of military commanders, noblemen, and sovereign rulers. These details recur, for example, in male portraits by Titian, as well as in the famous portrait of Charles I by Antonis van Dyck and Louis XIV by Hyacinthe Rigaud. The Carrara family is said to derive from a tribe of men of arms of Lombardian origin. In the Middle Ages, Lombardy was part of the Holy Roman Empire. Many noble families in North and Middle Italian cities claimed that their forefathers were soldiers or Roman settlers. It was common painting tradition to depict male ancestors as men of arms. Pietro Perugino painted a gallery of male ancestors for a dynasty in Umbria, illustrating each man as a soldier. The detail of the staff in the man's right hand, clutched with the thumb twisted down, resembles the famous statue of the Augustus of Prima Porta. This statue has a long history as a veritable pattern of representing an emperor or a military chief. Variations of this statue have been found in many parts of the former Roman Empire. This peculiar gesture, adopted from classical sculpture, reoccurs in the portrait of Andrea Doria as Neptune by Agnolo Bronzino. We also rediscover it in the picture of the French King Francis I as a Greek deity by Nicoletto da Modena. Giorgione himself also makes use of it in the male saint figure in armor in his celebrated altar piece, the Madonna of Castelfranco. The artist who created the statue of Augustus was probably inspired by ancient Persian soldiers' habits. The tradition to depict noblemen as men of arms goes back to King David of Israel, who is recorded as a king and a warrior. In the male figure in the Tempest painting, we recognize a military commander of German origin. The woman with the child resting beneath the tree is enclosed by lavish green plants. In Renaissance painting, female persons are often placed amidst a variety of plants, each carrying a particular symbolic content, as can be observed, for example, in Botticelli's work. Although the foreground scenery is bathed in shadowy hues of green and ochre, we can easily make out a distinctive treatment of plant foliage. The woman rests at the foot of a stout oak tree with a strong trunk and the typical curved leaves. Especially around the woman's head, the oak foliage is painted quite precisely. The same kind of tree reappears in many other Renaissance paintings, always as a symbol of fertility, loyalty, and durability. A huge oak tree painted in exactly the same manner, as a symbol of loyalty and endurance, dominates the scenery in the painting Moses Sat Before the Fire test, which many art historians attribute to Giorgione. Several members of the Carrara dynasty appear in this picture, as pointed out by Ugo Soragni. The oak tree also carried an emblematic content of female virtue. Many ladies' chambers in Renaissance palaces were decorated with wall paintings depicting oak leaves and acorns. In an ancient metaphoric Italian expression, a mother with many children was called a tree rich in fruit. On the woman's left side, we can detect a bush with dense tiny foliage, which is either a myrtle or a box tree. Both plants were symbols of brides and the virtues of the Virgin Mary. By arranging these botanical details, Giorgione follows common painting tradition. The woman wears a bridal veil, very much resembling the headdress of the Laura portrait by Giorgione. For various reasons, most art historians define this picture as a bridal portrait. The bridal veil recurs very often in Italian Renaissance painting, for example, in Raphael's portrait of the Fornarina, in the Lucrezia portrait in Frankfurt, and, of course, in the world's most famous painting, Leonardo's Mona Lisa. Elderly or married women never appear with this kind of hairdress. They usually appear in coiled plaits or with coronets and tiaras, as is well documented in the portraits by Titian, Savoldo, Palma il Vecchio, Lotto, Tintoretto, and other masters. Apart from that, we signify larger veils as an attribute of the Virgin Mary. The woman's hair is flowing down beside her ears, as described by Pietro Bembo in his poems written for the court in Asolo. The woman's lower body appears in the nude, which would have been an unthinkable offense against religious convention for a picture of the Holy Virgin. Her belly, though, is slightly curved as a typical symbol of fertility, a detail recurring in many wedding portraits. We discover it, for example, in the famous Arnolfini wedding by Jan van Eyck, as well as in the portrait of Johanna of Aragon, the wife of Philip of Burgundy, called Philip the Beautiful. Johanna's right hand points to her belly and, according to the stiff Spanish fashion, she wears a black bridal veil. She also wears a trail, and in the backdrop scenery behind her, we detect a little garden court with vivid young trees. Her husband, Philip, is clad in armor and wears his crown even on top of his helmet. The painter presents him as a king and a warrior. Behind his majestic figure, a section of a Burgundy castle wall, including 4 different towers, is visible, since Philip's mother was of Burgundy origin. The woman's breast is half bare. There is no explicit erotic content in this pose, since it constitutes a common symbol of virtue and truth, often applied to bridal portraits. The nursing of the child is an allusion to the female people of Amazons from Greek antiquity. The Amazons were not supposed to be lovers, but educated their children in a masculine way to bring them up as heroes. The woman in the Tempest painting is represented as taking care of her descendants. In Giorgione's times, it was common belief that the breastfeeding of children would pass the mother's virtues on to her babies. The woman rests on a white trail, characterizing her as a bride and a noble woman. The cloth around her shoulder is an obvious allusion to the antique statue of the Venus Pudica, the so-called chaste Venus. This allusion not only recurs in the Laura portrait, but also in a number of prominent Italian female portraits, such as Simonetta Vespucci by Botticelli. Even the flash of lightning in the sky is related to the mother and her child. Giorgione refers to an episode in the life of Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great of Macedonia. When Olympias was pregnant with her son, one night she saw a flash of lightning in the sky. In that very moment, she uttered the wish that her son might become divine. Alexander became one of the greatest conquerors in human history. In European painting, the lightning flash traditionally appears as a sign of God's presence. In the Old Testament, God appears as a thunderstorm. In Greek and Roman mythology, Jupiter's chief attribute is the lightning flash. Examining Venetian painting for another striking example of a lightning flash indicating God's presence, we don't have to leave the Accademia galleries. We discover it in the huge picture The Rescue of the Body of St. Mark's by Jacopo Tintoretto. The figures in the Tempesta are not scared by the lightning flash, since it is a harbinger of blessing and God's protection. Right to the woman's feet, a green shrub grows out of the barren ground. Close next to this shrub, we discover a dead, bare-branched plant. The juxtaposition of a green living tree and a dead one is a typical pictorial element evoking the concept of vanitas, especially for portraits of young people. We can discover it, for example, in many paintings by Titian, Francesco Franciabigio, and Palmavecchio. In the altar painting Jesus Baptized by St. John by Giovanni Bellini in the Santa Corona Church in Vicenza, the details appear exactly as composed by Giorgione. It is placed amidst the barren rocks along the riverside, in the immediate foreground on the right, between the viewer and the group of figures. Ugo Soragni, ex-chairman of the Cultural Heritage Association of the Veneto region, trustee of the important Giorgione exhibition in Padua in 2010, emphasizes that the subject of the Tempesta picture must be related to the city of Padua. Wolfgang Eller, author of the latest major monograph on Giorgione's work, claims that the backdrop of the Tempesta resembles the old town center of Padua. In 2007, he notes, the outline of the architecture alludes to the skyline of Padua with the river Bacchiglione. Evaluating the former appearance of the city of Padua by means of historic maps and topographical survey, the two art historians Antonio Boscardin and Enrico Guidoni postulate that the backdrop architecture in the painting forms a part of the old city fortification. According to Boscardin, the painting shows the so-called Carrarese walls, a section of the city walls constructed in the era of the Carrarese rule. The church on the left with the domed roof is, according to both scientists, a just slightly altered silhouette of the Carmine church in the old town center. The edifice between the church and the flat-roofed tower shows the typical shape of a Sala Regia, a North Italian city hall. For many decades, the Carrara family had been the leaders of the Paduan City Council. Further to the right, a rectangular tower looms into the sky. Apparently, it is not connected to the fortified walls. The historian Camillo Semenzato notes that the Carrarese family had a dynastic tower in the old town center, which stood at least until the early Renaissance period. Furthermore, he notes that the old university building had a bell tower with a flat roof. The Carrarese family, well educated in humanist matters, belong to the early patrons of the Paduan University. The treatment of fragmented, authentic architectural views arranged into an abstract assembly of buildings had already developed before Giorgione's times, as we can demonstrate in Giovanni Bellini's religious works. On the left side, behind the puzzling architectural fragments, a short winding path or trail leads into the distance, turning to the right across the wooden bridge and into the gate. Above the gate, we detect the Carrara's coat of arms, an unmistakable indication that this edifice is related to this family. From the 15th century on, it was not unusual for noblemen or political leaders to be portrayed in front of their residence. A castle or fortified wall in the backdrop marked the home of nobility. The architectural outline on the painting's right side clearly shows a fortification. This detail alludes to the biblical quotation from the Old Testament, "God is my rock and my castle." The backdrop composition seems to recall the holy city as described in the Revelation by the Apostle John, where it says, "The city had no need of the sun or of the moon, for the glory of God illuminated it. In the middle of its street and on either side of the river was the tree of life, and he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal." Consequently, the compositional element of a twisting road into the remote distance or into a castle or fortified settlement recurs very often in Renaissance painting. We detect it in numerous portraits, altar pictures, and biblical themes in painting culture all over Europe. It usually represents a Christian way of life, which eventually leads into the Civitas Dei, respectively into heavenly Jerusalem. This stylistic device was quite common in Giorgione's circle of artists such as Palma Vecchio, Giovanni Bellini, Cimada Corneliano, Mantegna, Basaiti, and of course in Flemish and German painting. Furthermore, the skyline of the Civitas Dei always was dominated by numerous towers and spires, each shaped differently, designed individually. In the Tempest painting, it is immediately obvious that Giorgione was aiming to compose a cityscape with a curious variety of towers. The bridge placed in the center of the painting is a common allusion to the office of the Pontifices, the so-called bridge builders from ancient Rome. The same allusion also appears, for example, in Jan van Eyck's famous Madonna of the Chancellor Rollin. During the Republican period in Rome, the Pontifices had the supreme office as custodians of the true religion. During the Carrarese rule, the city of Padua went through a very long and prosperous Republican period. A cluster of trees marks the curved path or track behind the male figure. These trees are characterized by bold, tall, and straight stems and carry a lofty fan-shaped or rhombic top. Judging by their crowns, foliage, and outline, they very much resemble rowan trees, which appear in hundreds of Renaissance paintings as symbols of Christianity. In a most conspicuous way, this sort of tree is positioned precisely in the center of Giorgione's painting Il Tramonto, or The Sunset. Especially in portraits and religious works, they symbolize redemption and the dissemination of Christian faith. In some matrimonial portraits, as for example in the pictures of Dr. Cuspinian and his wife by Lucas Cranach, they are placed between the two partners. Two of the tree trunks in the Tempesta cross each other in a very narrow angle. The peculiar device of two intersecting tree trunks is often to be found in contemporary painting, as for example in Albrecht Dürer's famous Rosary celebration, or in the altarpiece Madonna with the Child and 6 saint figures by Bonifacio Veronese. At first sight, the observation that the cluster of tree stems precisely intersects the perspective on the trail bands may seem a little far-fetched or beside the point, yet we also detect it in Bellini's aforementioned painting, as well as in Andrea Boltraffio's work. A big white bird sits on the little wooden roof on top of the gate tower. Although this bird cannot be defined with certainty, judging by its size, color, and the shape of its neck, it very much resembles a swan. This bird, apart from its role in the ancient myth of Leda, was known for its courage and braveness. A swan fiercely defends its nest and family even against stronger and bigger enemies. Placed on top of a town fortification of a certain family, it stands for the defense and courage of its inhabitants. The swan is a common attribute to pictures of castles and fortresses surrounded by moats, already in the Duke of Berry's famous and beautiful Book of Hours. The emblematic content of the swan as a defender of home was passed on into the 17th century painting by Jan Asselein and Franz Snyders. Furthermore, the swan is an animal of matrimonial fidelity. A marriage of two swans usually lasts for many years. Last but not least, the famous tale of the Swan Knight, set to music by Richard Wagner, tells the story of a medieval hero who sets out to save a young princess from a forced marriage and abducted her on a giant swan. Of course, contemplating Giorgione's painting, one may object that swans usually do not take rest on rooftops of tall buildings. Numerous scholars have observed that the group of figures in the Tempest painting is situated in an enclosed and protected space, comfortably sheltered from the thunderstorm coming up behind them. The setting in a nature hideout underlines the traditional role of the couple as secret lovers. This tradition encompasses famous couples such as Adam and Eve, Rinaldo and Armida, or Acis and Galatea. Even wedding portraits were quite often arranged in an intimate garden scenery, such as the famous honeysuckle pergola, the wedding picture showing the self-portrait of Rubens together with his young wife. Pietro Bembo, a famous humanist author of the early 16th century, best known in Giorgione's circles, writes in his Conversations of Asolo, a treatise about love, that untouched nature always was the consolation of secret lovers. Not surprisingly, many art historians are seeking an explanation for the Tempesta in a scene taken from a story of love. About the year 1500, presumably during his well-documented working period in Padua before taking up commissions in Venice, Giorgione paints a pair of small pictures on wood panels. Today, they are exhibited in the city's municipal museum. These so-called cassone paintings were usually designed to adorn pieces of family furniture. The first of Giorgione's little panels shows the Greek myth of Leda seduced by the swan. The composition of the second picture has a resemblance with the Tempesta. The seated male figure holds a little twig in his hand, probably a mistletoe. The young lady, obviously no peasant girl, holds a little child in her arms. The similarity of the two crossing tree trunks cannot be missed. The tale of Leda and the swan is basically the story of a noble woman with illegitimate children who are later to become historic heroes. The brick base with the two cut-off white columns on top have often been interpreted as symbols of righteous rule. Several observations in contemporary painting confirm this. A column as an emblem of noble leadership was not restricted to the imperial court of Habsburg. It can be detected in paintings by Hans Memling, Lucas Cranach, and very conspicuous by Piero della Francesca. On the verso of his famous portrait of Federigo da Montefeltre, Duke of Urbino, the painter depicted a horse cart carrying 4 female figures, each personifying one virtue. The woman impersonating justness and righteous rule is holding a broken column. In later centuries, a column base or a broken column is adorning the famous portraits of King Louis XIV of France and the Empress Catherine the Great of Russia. In the Middle Ages and up to the 15th century, the Carrara dynasty held the major merits of Padua's prosperity and its political power. Even in Giorgione's era, several family members were regarded as chief representatives of the city republic. In the fortified town of Cittadella, situated about 17 miles north of Padua, the Carrara coat of arms still today adorns the old city gates. Cittadella used to be a military garrison and stronghold of the Paduan territory, just 6 miles from Castelfranco del Veneto, Giorgione's hometown. The origin of the Carrara family is located in the countryside south of Padua, around the year 1000. Written records say that this family descends from the powerful court of the German emperor. The internet site of Cittadella features a short sightseeing video of its beautiful old town fortification. This video includes a short legend concerning the origin of the name Carrara. The tale goes that a daughter of the German emperor, una figlia dell'imperatore tedesco, fell in love with a young gentleman, but the imperial court did not approve of this bond. So the lovers took refuge in the vast woods of Monselice and together they built up a house of rare beauty, in Italian una casa di rara bellezza, hence Carrara. This etymologic root may seem a little far-fetched or clumsy, yet a similar story is recorded by several scholars. Sources in local history can easily be traced back into the 14th century. Monselice today is a little town south of Padua, on the foot of the Eogan Hills, a wooded mountain range of volcanic origin. The tale of an imperial German princess and a young soldier was recorded at least 120 years before Giorgione. However, it is not documented by ancestors' research. It rather resembles a number of similar stories of Italian and other European noble families who could not give documented evidence of their earliest blue-blooded ancestors. In short, our legend would have three implications. First, the emperor's daughter did neither have an official husband nor wedding. Second, she fled from the imperial court. Third, the contribution of her blue blood marked the origin of a noble family. In various historical tales, we can read of young ladies who, accused of adultery or being pregnant with an illegitimate baby, get outcast or take refuge in the woods. Many scientific interpretations, as well as the intuitive impressions of thousands of viewers, describe the woman in the Tempest as an outcast person. In a video documentary by the Italian Rai Television, the woman is called an untouchable and excluded. The Tempesta painting is a small picture, not one of representative dimensions. It illustrates an intimate story that needs to be decoded with considerable humanist background knowledge. Moreover, the painting's subject matter is not unique in its period. At least two other paintings to be dated around the year 1500, one by Palmalvecchio, who worked on the Venetian mainland, are depicting a family foundation. Each painting features a soldier and a young bride with children amidst an untouched country scenery. Around the year 1500, many Italian dynasties did not claim to have root in ancient lineage and titles, they rather cultivated a parvenu attitude. Many of them were proud to have risen into titles and wealth by force or by cunning maneuvers. Wolfgang Eller claims that an obvious and clear meaning of the painting's subject as a Christian or ancient story was not Giorgione's intention. Actually, and in the first place, we are looking at the young couple of the urban gentry in front of their town of origin or their place of residence. On the basis of recent research, taking into consideration classical iconography, the architectural elements, especially the city gate with its coat of arms, contemporary North Italian painting, and the little story about the origin of the Carrara dynasty, we have to conclude that the Tempest painting illustrates this very legend. The young German soldier is looking at the outcast woman and he's falling in love with her. In Renaissance philosophy of love, it is the sight of somebody that will stir the first amorous thoughts. The woman has either been cast out by her first family or she has fled from her original home. At least two questions remain to be answered. We could consider the meaning of the fragmentary brick building behind the young soldier. It very much resembles a ruin of a Romanesque Italian edifice. For a Renaissance artist like Giorgione, this style of architecture represented the Middle Ages. By featuring this building fragment, the painter gives his story a medieval setting. Second, the woman's glance at the viewer is very curious and puzzling. It has caused considerable confusion about her role in this sophisticated work of art. With the background knowledge we have gained, it seems unlikely that the painter was attempting to confuse the viewer about the subject. Especially among Venetian 16th century painters, it was very fashionable to portray original living persons in historical settings. In many pictures, these persons could easily be identified because they were depicted looking at the viewer. We quickly discover this tradition in works by Veronese, Carpaccio, Mantegna, Titian, but also by Botticelli, Raphael, Dürer, and many others. We have to suppose that the woman in the Tempesta has a vivid likeness with a young lady well known to the painting's commissioner. Her rather uncomfortable body position is taken up again in the painting Susanna with the Elders by Tintoretto. Susanna's role in the Old Testament is understood to be that of the faithful wife. Eventually, we have to conclude that if Marcantonio Michel had examined the picture closely while he was going over Gabriele Vendramin's collection, he might have detected the coat of arms above the gate. Being familiar with pictorial conventions, he would at once have concluded that this painting has to be associated with the Carrara family. Wherever we detect a coat of arms in Italian painting, there is a close relation to the family and the commissioner.